Hello, and welcome back to the Fireside Lit Book Club, a quiet, candlelit corner of the internet where we read slowly, think deeply, and speak authentically about our experiences. I'm Lindsay, and I invite you to join me by the fire as we explore the soul of a book, the beauty it reveals, the questions it asks, and the ways it helps us understand life, identity, and meaning just a little more clearly. So, to all the Jane Austen fans out there who may have stumbled upon this episode, please don't come at me. But we are actually going to be talking today about why I feel like Jane Austen is fantastically overrated. And I say that while also admitting I'm a huge fan of the 2005 film adaptation of Pride and Prejudice starring Keira Knightley. And I didn't actually loathe the book. In fact, it was one of the better ones I read by Austen. But in general and on the whole, she is one author who is definitely not for me. Now, I realize these are very strong statements to make, especially as someone who is an English major and is an author herself. So we're going to spend some time talking about why I have such big feelings about Jane Austen today. If you think you can stomach this one, even if you are a diehard Austen fan, I'm very happy you're here, and I would love to hear your own thoughts in the comment section. So as of today, I've read 3 Austen novels: Pride and Prejudice, Northanger Abbey, and approximately 1/3 of Emma. And I know, many of you might be saying, oh, she has 6 books, that's not a big enough sampling. But for me personally, I feel like 3-ish books is plenty for me to be able to speak with some amount of knowledge on Jane Austen's writing and my impressions of it. Emma was my latest Austen read. I sat down with it with high hopes, thinking maybe I'd missed something with her other 2 books. And again, I didn't hate Pride and Prejudice. It just didn't wow me the way it seems to wow everyone else. And instead, I was just as disappointed with Emma as I'd been with Northanger Abbey. I found myself counting chapters each time I reached the end of one, calculating how many more weeks I'd be spending with the novel, before I finally just decided, life is too short for this kind of drudgery, even for the likes of the renowned Jane Austen. And I put it back on the shelf for good. You may be wondering what about her I object to so much, and it's a few things really. But before we get into my personal tastes and preferences, I wanted to spend some time discussing what made Austen so groundbreaking at the time of writing, and why I feel like that probably kickstarted her career as an author and made her world famous. So Austen was the first English novelist to master and make sustained use of something called the free indirect discourse. And what this is a literary technique that blends a third-person narrative with the inner voice and consciousness of a character. It allows the narrator to recount the story objectively while subtly adopting the character's vocabulary, opinions, and emotions without using explicit attribution like she thought or he wondered. Today, we tend to take this writing style for granted. Pick up any book, essentially, and there's a very good chance it uses free indirect discourse. But at the time, this was apparently a pretty revolutionary writing style. While she did not strictly invent the technique, Jane Austen was the first author to use it consistently throughout entire novels. So readers felt as though they were getting a front row seat to the main character's thoughts and motivations. I also acknowledge that Austen was probably the original rom-com creator, and that many of our romance novels and movies are modeled after tropes she used in her work. Unfortunately for me, that just isn't really enough to make me a fan. I think part of my disappointment came from the expectations I maybe had going in. Popular culture sold me a romance novelist, but what I found instead was a novelist of manners. I expected sweeping romances to take center stage, but the romances almost seem to happen in the margins in these books. It becomes clear as you read that Austen is primarily interested in observing people and evaluating character and navigating social expectations. And while I completely understand why that appeals to so many readers, I realized pretty quickly that it's simply not what I'm looking for when I pick up a novel. When I sit down with a book, I'm hoping to come away changed, really, or to consider things in a light that I hadn't before. I want the book to ask questions about the human condition, I want it to wrestle with suffering and morality and love and death and identity. And Austen, for the most part, doesn't really seem that interested in these questions, and that's okay, but it just means I'm probably never going to be her reader. Going a step further, while I think Austen's use of the free indirect discourse was enough to get her published and noticed in the literary world in the 1700s, I don't think her novels would have been interesting or riveting enough to get published today. Not only do they frequently lack a strong plot, but her character-driven approach isn't even compelling. And again, that's my opinion, but her characters and stories all revolve around the same tired ideas: establishing the right connections, meeting a man, and visiting with neighbors and friends. Entire chapters are devoted to trivial drawing room conversations, town gossip, and other uninteresting facets of daily life. And listen, as an author myself, I could easily sit down and write a 10-page chapter that word for word describes my daily interactions with my husband and my mom, but I wouldn't expect an entire book of that content to get published. It simply wouldn't be interesting. Now, I'm aware that in the 18th century, Jane Austen was likely just writing what she knew. Women didn't have particularly interesting lives. Their lives were the drawing room conversations and town gossip, and scheming to meet potential suitors. I want to be fair about that. But when I compare Jane Austen's work to the work of Mary Shelley, for instance, she was a spectacularly complex writer and was essentially Austen's contemporary. She explored themes of morality, good and evil, and love and abandonment. Marianne Evans, also known as George Eliot, was born around the same time Austen died, so her work came not long after, and her novels are absolutely breathtaking. What's interesting is that, though the characters in her book Middlemarch live quite similarly to the female characters in Austen's novels, in equally small worlds, they are three-dimensional, with passion and ambition and painfully real struggles in their marriages and relationships. If someone's going to write about a woman's experience, even hundreds of years ago, there has to be more to discuss than social climbing and husband hunting. Finally, nowhere in Austen's novels do I encounter the supposedly great satire that she's known for. I'm not sure who first attributed this quality to her writing, but I think there must be a bit of a bias here. Either that or the satire is so dry that readers can't even detect it easily, making her work just not humorous. If we're talking about satirists, I think of Virginia Woolf, whose work has made me laugh out loud on multiple occasions. I can see it with Charlotte Perkins Gilman and with Flannery O'Connor, whose work I don't connect with for other reasons. But Jane Austen as a satirist? No, sorry. I don't see that one. With all of that said, I do plan on reading Persuasion to give Austen one final try, as I've heard this novel is her most mature and complex. So there's a small part of me that's holding out hope for that experience, as I don't want to hate the author that every literary buff on the planet seems to adore, but I'm not particularly optimistic at this point. I feel similarly about Charles Dickens, whose work I've read across a few novels and ultimately just does not hold my interest. And again, all of this is strictly a matter of opinion, and I'm obviously in the minority. According to the tastes and recommendations of all great literary theorists and aficionados, I may even be ignorant, but I just can't stand how there is currently what feels like this big Jane Austen resurgence. I do not understand it, and it makes me so annoyed when I walk into my local bookstore and they're selling Jane Austen-themed paraphernalia. Like, why is this the author we're spotlighting? Somehow, she's become this symbol of cozy femininity, teacups, floral journals, Mr. Darcy tote bags, and I find that strange because when I think of women's literature, there are so many richer voices we could be celebrating. And with the flourishes and embellishments on these things they're selling, they're obviously trying to appeal to the female demographic, which I just kind of find obnoxious. They do this with Little Women too, side note, which also annoys me because while I like the story and the film adaptations, the book itself is like a 400-page sermon. So boring and way too much superfluous detail. Again, that's just me. So I digress. There are a number of female authors who were more skilled in the art of novel writing than Jane Austen. Charlotte and Emily Bronte, for instance, wrote novels that are replete with emotional intensity, passion, and moral conflict. They taught me from my teenage years that romance isn't just torrid, but either healthy or unhealthy. I adore George Eliot for her use of psychological realism and philosophical depth and complex characterization in her books. Dorothea Brooke from Middlemarch is one of the most extraordinary characters in literature I have ever encountered. I love, love, love Virginia Woolf for her innovative prose, consciousness, humor, and interiority, especially in books like Orlando and A Room of One's Own. And I admire Mary Shelley for her ambitious philosophical ideas and moral questions, such as those posed in Frankenstein. These authors all truly added something to the literary tradition with their work, while Jane Austen gave us dinner scenes that lag on for 20 pages without introducing a single humorous or interesting tidbit. Again, all of these are just my opinions, and I suspect they won't resonate with the majority of lit lovers out there, but this is one episode in particular where I would really like to hear your own opinions. Do you relate to any of my feelings toward Jane Austen, and what are your particular gripes with her style, if so? If you totally disagree, why do you love her? What am I missing? Please, I need someone to enlighten me. As always, I want to thank you for joining me around the fire this evening. Keep reading, and I'll meet you back here very soon.